Overnight, Trump dropped a massive announcement, one that instantly sent global markets humming, foreign governments scrambling, and millions of Americans asking the same question, why now? Because this wasn't just another policy update, this wasn't a routine press release. This was a clear message to our allies, to our adversaries, and to the American people that the rules of the game are changing again. For decades, the U.S. has been quietly chipped away, whether through broken borders, predatory trade practices, manipulation from foreign powers, or the slow erosion of our ability to produce and protect what we rely on most: our food, our energy, and our future. But this new announcement signals something different. A reset, a counterpunch, a line in the sand. In today's video, we're unpacking exactly what Trump just announced, why it matters right now, how it ties together immigration, national security, and America's economic survival, and what it all means for seniors, families, and everyday Americans who just want honesty, stability, and a country they can trust again. So let's start by setting the stage here, because context matters. And if you're like most Americans right now, you've probably been feeling this low-grade anxiety building for years. Maybe it started when you noticed the grocery bills climbing higher and higher, or when you turned on the news and saw yet another story about chaos at the southern border. Perhaps it was the realization that so much of what we buy, medicines, electronics, even basic household goods, comes from somewhere else, from countries that don't necessarily wish us well. This didn't happen overnight. For decades, Washington made choices that slowly weakened America's foundations. We shipped our manufacturing jobs overseas because labor was cheaper there. We became dependent on foreign nations for critical supplies. We opened our borders without proper systems to know who was coming in or why. And perhaps most dangerously, we allowed foreign powers to manipulate our economy in ways that hurt American workers, American farmers, and American families. Think about it this way. Imagine you own a small business, and for years, a bigger competitor across town has been undercutting your prices, not to make a profit, but specifically to drive you out of business. They're willing to lose money in the short term because once you're gone, they control the entire market. That's not fair competition, that's predatory behavior. And that's exactly what's been happening to America on the global stage. So when Trump made this announcement, it wasn't coming out of nowhere. It was a direct response to vulnerabilities that have been building for generations. The American people have been watching their country drift, feeling like nobody in power was willing to say the hard truths or make the tough decisions. But this announcement, it signaled something different. It said, we see what's happening, we understand the threats, and we're going to do something about it. Now, the announcement had multiple layers: immigration policy, agricultural protection, national security reforms, and they're all connected. But to really understand why this matters, we need to start with the most controversial piece, the one that had media commentators and foreign leaders talking for days. Trump's call to return to the principles of the 1920s Immigration Act. I know what you might be thinking. Why would we look backward to a law from over 100 years ago? And that's a fair question. But here's the thing, sometimes the old wisdom holds truths we've forgotten. Back in the early 1900s, America experienced something called the Great Migration. Over a relatively short period, between 10 and 15 million people flooded into the country, mostly from Southern and Eastern Europe. We're talking about Italians, Poles, Russians, people fleeing hardship and seeking opportunity in America. Now, many of those immigrants worked hard, built businesses, raised families, and became part of the American fabric. But the sheer scale and speed of that migration created enormous social disruption. Communities couldn't absorb that many newcomers that quickly. There were language barriers, cultural clashes, economic strains. American workers found themselves competing for jobs with people willing to work for less. Cities became overcrowded. Social services were overwhelmed. And so, in the mid-1920s, Congress, Republicans and Democrats together passed the Immigration Act. This law established strict quotas based on national origin. It prioritized immigrants from countries whose populations already reflected America's demographic makeup, and it severely restricted or banned immigration from other regions. The goal was simple: give America time to breathe, to assimilate the people who were already here, to stabilize communities, and preserve social cohesion. Now, here's the part that often gets left out of modern discussions. It worked. For nearly 4 decades, that law remained in place. Immigration slowed dramatically. The families who had come during the Great Migration had time to learn English, adopt American customs, start businesses, and integrate into society. By the 1940s and 50s, America was thriving, economically strong, socially cohesive, patriotic, united in ways that seem almost unimaginable today. That period of restricted immigration allowed assimilation to actually happen. The children and grandchildren of those earlier immigrants became fully American, not just in legal status, but in identity, values, and loyalty. They fought in World War II. They built the great American middle class. They believed in this country because they had time to become part of it. So when Trump references the 1920s Immigration Act, he's not talking about recreating every detail of that old law. What he's pointing to is the principle behind it, that immigration must be controlled, selective, and focused on national interest. That we should prioritize people who will add to America, not strain it. That assimilation matters. That a nation has the right, actually, the responsibility to decide who gets to come in. Compare that to what we've seen in recent years. The southern border has been essentially open, with millions crossing illegally. Many of these migrants come from countries with very different cultural values, different languages, different systems of government. And instead of a structured process that allows for gradual assimilation, we've had chaos people released into American communities with little to no vetting, minimal resources, and no clear expectation that they'll integrate into American society. The result? Strained schools, overwhelmed hospitals, increased crime in some areas, and American workers once again competing for jobs and housing. It's the same pattern from a century ago, except now it's even more destabilized because there's no coherent policy, no agreement on what immigration should look like or what its purpose should be. Trump's call to return to those principles is essentially saying, let's get serious again. Let's have an immigration system that serves America's interests. Let's prioritize people with skills, education, and the willingness to assimilate. Let's make sure we can actually vet who's coming in. And let's give our country time to absorb and integrate the people who are already here. And that wasn't just talk. Because shortly after Trump made that statement, the Department of Homeland Security announced something that sent shockwaves through diplomatic channels. They were extending travel restrictions to over 30 countries. Not just the original group of nations flagged for security concerns, but an expanded list of countries deemed too unstable, too dysfunctional, or too compromised to properly vet their citizens. Think about what that means for a moment. The U.S. government is essentially saying, if your country doesn't have a functioning system to tell us who someone is, what their background is, whether they pose a security risk, then we can't allow them to come here. That's not discrimination based on prejudice. That's basic common sense. If a nation can't even document its own people, how can we trust that dangerous individuals won't slip through? The list includes countries and regions plagued by terrorism, civil war, corruption, and failed governance. Places where record-keeping is non-existent, where criminals and extremists move freely, where governments either can't or won't cooperate with American security agencies. And yes, one of those countries is Somalia. Now, Somalia is particularly relevant here, not because of any prejudice toward Somali people, but because of what's been happening in places like Minnesota, where large Somali immigrant communities have settled over the past couple of decades. And this is where things get uncomfortable, because we're about to talk about fraud, crime, and the failure of certain leaders to hold their own communities accountable. Investigative reporters have uncovered massive fraud schemes within some of these immigrant communities. We're talking billions of dollars in stolen taxpayer money. COVID relief funds, child nutrition programs, other federal assistance siphoned off by criminal networks operating within communities that were supposed to be integrating into American society. Some of this money, investigators believe, was wired overseas, potentially to extremist groups. And when confronted with this, when asked about the fraud and the victims and the betrayal of American trust, some leaders, like Representative Ilhan Omar, have responded not with outrage at the criminals, but with defensiveness and deflection. There was even a moment in a recent interview where she appeared to giggle when asked whether stolen American funds were going to terror groups. Giggle. Now, contrast that with how immigrant communities used to police themselves. A century ago, when Italian immigrants came to America, some brought organized crime with them, the mafia. But what happened? Legitimate Italian-American leaders, law enforcement figures, community organizers, they fought against that element. They didn't defend the criminals. They didn't make excuses. They said, these people don't represent us, and we're going to help root them out. That's what assimilation looks like. That's what loyalty to your new country looks like. You reject the worst elements of where you came from and embrace the best of where you are now. But when leaders like Ilhan Omar defend or downplay fraud in their own communities, when they compare reasonable security measures to Nazi Germany, when they prioritize identity politics over accountability, that's the opposite of assimilation. That's a failure of leadership. And it's exactly why Trump's immigration announcement matters. Because if we're going to bring people into this country, we need to know they're going to become Americans, not just geographically, but in values and allegiance. We need leaders who will hold their communities to high standards, not make excuses for criminal behavior. So that's the immigration piece, strict vetting, prioritizing assimilation, restoring control over who enters the country. But Trump's announcement didn't stop there, because while the media was busy arguing about immigration policy, he dropped another bombshell, one that speaks directly to American economic security, a $12 billion emergency aid package for American farmers. Now, at first glance, you might wonder, what does agriculture have to do with immigration and national security? Everything, actually. Because what's been happening to American farmers over the past several years is a textbook case of economic warfare, and most Americans have no idea it's even happening. Here's how it works. Foreign countries, particularly China and other nations aligned in economic blocs designed to challenge American power, have been flooding the U.S. market with cheap agricultural products. Rice, wheat, soybeans, pork, you name it. They're selling these products at prices so low that American farmers can't compete. And here's the kicker. These farm producers are often willing to lose money doing it. Why would anyone intentionally lose money? Because the goal isn't profit in the short term, it's market control in the long term. If you can drive American farmers out of business, if you can make agriculture dependent on foreign imports, then you've weaponized food. You've created a vulnerability that can be exploited later. Think back to what happened with manufacturing over the past few decades. We shipped our factories to China and other countries because labor was cheaper there. American workers lost their jobs. Entire communities built around manufacturing collapsed. And then when COVID hit and we suddenly needed medical supplies, masks, ventilators, we discovered we couldn't make them ourselves anymore. We were dependent on the very country that many experts believe allowed the virus to spread in the first place. China essentially told us, you're on your own, and we were helpless. That's what happens when you lose the ability to make things for yourself. And now, the same playbook is being run against American agriculture. Foreign adversaries are intentionally undercutting our farmers, trying to destroy our food production capacity, so that one day, maybe in a crisis, maybe during a conflict, they can leverage that dependency against us. Food security is national security. If you can't feed your own people, you're not truly sovereign. You're vulnerable. So Trump's $12 billion aid package isn't just a subsidy or a bailout, it's a counterpunch. It's a way to keep American farmers afloat while the administration works on broader trade reforms to stop the dumping, to punish the predatory practices, to restore fair competition. The goal is to preserve America's agricultural capacity, to make sure that no matter what happens in the world, we can feed ourselves. And you know what happened almost immediately after that announcement? China blinked. Within days, Chinese officials were reaching out, signaling willingness to negotiate new trade agreements, new purchase commitments for American agricultural products, because they realized that Trump wasn't going to let them slowly strangle American farming the way they helped hollow out American manufacturing. This is what strength looks like in international relations. Not aggression for its own sake, but a willingness to defend your interests, to push back against unfair practices, and to make it clear that exploitation won't be tolerated. Now, let's be honest here, the $12 billion is a temporary measure. It's a bridge meant to stabilize things while deeper changes happen. Because the real problem isn't just foreign dumping, it's that American farming has become economically unsustainable for many families. Costs have skyrocketed: land, equipment, fuel, labor, while crop prices have stagnated or fallen. Many farmers today are operating at a loss, going deeper into debt just to keep planting each season. This isn't Trump's fault. This has been building for years. But what makes his announcement significant is that it acknowledges the problem and treats it as a matter of national urgency, not just an economic issue but a security issue. Because a country that can't grow its own food is a country living on borrowed time. And here's where all these pieces start to connect. Immigration policy, agricultural security, border control, trade enforcement, they're all part of the same picture. They're all about restoring America's ability to stand on its own, to not be dependent on hostile foreign powers, to control our own destiny. For decades, Washington operated on this assumption that globalization was inevitable and good, that we should integrate our economy with everyone else's, that borders and national identity were old-fashioned concepts. And maybe in a perfect world, that would work. But we don't live in a perfect world. We live in a world where other countries are absolutely ruthless in pursuing their own interests, where economic competition is a form of warfare, where dependency equals vulnerability. Trump's announcement is essentially rejecting that globalist framework. It's saying, America's interests come first, we're going to control our borders, we're going to protect our industries, we're going to make sure we can feed ourselves and defend ourselves, and if that makes other countries uncomfortable, well, that's their problem, not ours. But of course, not everyone in Washington agrees with this approach. And that brings us to another dimension of the story, one that reveals just how much resistance Trump faces, even from within his own administration. Because just days after Trump made these announcements, rumors started swirling through Washington that one of his key cabinet members was on thin ice. Media outlets began reporting that Kristi Noem, the Secretary of Homeland Security, might be out as early as next month. Sources, always unnamed sources, claimed she was facing growing frustration from senior White House officials, particularly Stephen Miller, Trump's deputy chief of staff, who focuses heavily on immigration policy. The complaints? That Noem hadn't moved fast enough to build out detention facilities for illegal immigrants? That she wasn't being responsive enough to governors dealing with disaster relief? That there was friction over how quickly DHS could implement Trump's aggressive immigration agenda? Now, here's where you need to read between the lines a little bit, because this pattern, anonymous sources, whisper campaigns, reports of internal chaos, we've seen it before. Remember just a few weeks ago when similar stories circulated about Kash Patel? The media was absolutely convinced he was on his way out, that Trump had lost confidence, that it was only a matter of time. And what happened? Nothing. Patel's still there, doing his job. So why do these stories keep appearing? Well, there are a few possibilities. Sometimes it's legitimate internal disagreement in any large organization. People clash over strategy and priorities. But often, these stories serve another purpose entirely. They're a way for people opposed to Trump's agenda to create pressure, to sow doubt, to make the administration look chaotic and dysfunctional. Think about it. If you're a career government official who opposes strict immigration enforcement, what better way to undermine it than by attacking the person in charge of implementing it? You leak unflattering stories. You make it seem like she's failing. You create the perception that change is inevitable. And maybe, just maybe, you force the president's hand. There's also another dynamic at play here, one that's been true throughout American history. Strong leaders generate strong resistance. When you're actually trying to change things, when you're disrupting comfortable arrangements, when you're demanding accountability and results, people push back. Bureaucracies resist. Political opponents attack. Media amplifies every criticism. So the question isn't really whether Kristi Noem faces criticism. The question is whether she's actually failing at her job or whether she's facing resistance because she's succeeding at implementing policies that powerful interests don't like. From what we can see publicly, border enforcement numbers have improved significantly. The catch-and-release policy that dominated previous years, where illegal border crossers were apprehended and then released into American communities has essentially ended. For 7 straight months now, not a single apprehended illegal immigrant has been released into the country. That's a complete reversal from the previous administration's approach. Detention facilities are being built, though not as quickly as some would like. FEMA disaster response has continued, though like any large government agency, there are always complaints about speed and efficiency. These are complicated operations with a lot of moving parts. So is Noam actually going to be fired? I doubt it. Trump learned painful lessons from his first term about constantly cycling through cabinet members. He knows it creates distraction, wastes time, and makes it harder to implement long-term strategy. Unless there's a genuine, serious failure, something that fundamentally undermines the mission, he's likely to stick with his people and ignore the noise. And that's probably the right call. Because what matters isn't whether some anonymous White House official told a reporter they're frustrated. What matters is whether the policies are working. And on that front, the evidence suggests they are. Border encounters are down significantly. We're talking about numbers in the 30,000 range per month compared to peaks that were more than 5 times higher during previous years. Now, is that perfect? No. Is there still work to do? Absolutely. But it's movement in the right direction, which is more than we could say during the previous administration. And here's what's really important to understand. Border security isn't just about stopping people from crossing illegally. It's about knowing who's in your country. It's about being able to track criminals, identify threats, and maintain basic social order. When you have millions of people living in the shadows, unregistered, unvetted, moving from place to place without documentation, that's a security nightmare. Every nation on earth controls its borders. Even the most progressive European countries, the ones that opened their doors to massive refugee flows in recent years, they're now tightening restrictions because they've seen the consequences of losing control. Crime spikes, social services overwhelmed, cultural tensions rising, integration failing. America went through this exact cycle. We opened the borders, we stopped enforcing our laws, we prioritized compassion without thinking about consequences. And now we're dealing with the fallout. Sanctuary cities struggling with costs, schools unable to handle students who don't speak English, hospitals providing care to people who can't pay, criminal gangs from other countries operating in American neighborhoods. So when Trump talks about securing the border, when Noam works to build detention facilities and catch and release, when DHS expands travel restrictions to unstable countries, that's not cruelty. That's basic governance. That's what every functional country does. And frankly, it's long overdue. But border security is just one piece of what Trump's announcement was really about. Because at its core, this wasn't just about immigration policy or agricultural subsidies or travel bans. It was about redefining what national security actually means in the 21st century. For too long, Washington has thought about security in purely military terms. How many troops do we have? How many ships, planes, missiles? Are we ready to fight wars overseas? And yes, military strength matters, no one's arguing otherwise. But true security is much broader than that. National security means being able to feed your population without depending on foreign imports. It means having the manufacturing capacity to produce what you need in a crisis. It means controlling your borders so you know who's in your country. It means protecting your technology and intellectual property from theft. It means having energy independence so hostile nations can't hold you hostage. It means maintaining social cohesion so you're not torn apart by internal divisions. When you look at Trump's announcement through this lens, all the pieces fit together. Immigration restrictions, that's about maintaining social cohesion and preventing the importation of foreign conflicts. Agricultural aid, that's about food security and economic resilience. Border enforcement, that's about basic sovereignty and social order. These aren't separate issues, they're all connected. And they're all essential to ensuring that America remains strong, independent, and capable of taking care of its own people. And here's where things get really interesting. Because Trump's thinking about security doesn't stop with the obvious stuff. Just this week, we learned that the administration is focusing on something most Americans haven't even thought about yet: humanoid robotics. Now, I know that might sound like science fiction, but stay with me here, because this is actually a huge deal. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick has reportedly been meeting with tech company leaders to prepare an executive order that would accelerate domestic development of humanoid robots. We're talking about machines that look and move like humans, that can perform complex tasks, work alongside people, potentially transform entire industries. Why is this a national security priority? Because China is going all in on robotics. They've made it a central part of their national industrial strategy. They're pouring resources into developing robots that can work in factories, serve in hospitals, operate in hazardous environments, anywhere you might otherwise need human labor. And here's the thing, whoever dominates this technology first will have an enormous economic and military advantage. Imagine having robots that can work around the clock without fatigue, that can be deployed in dangerous situations, that can manufacture products with perfect consistency. Imagine the productivity gains, the cost reductions, the strategic flexibility. Now, some people hear this and think, great, more jobs lost to automation. And that's a legitimate concern. We've already seen what happens when technology displaces workers, communities collapse, families struggle, resentment builds. But the reality is, this technology is coming, whether we lead in developing it or not. The question is, do we want China controlling it, or do we want America controlling it? If American companies lead in robotics, the economic benefits stay here. The research jobs, the manufacturing jobs building the robots, the service jobs maintaining them, that all happens domestically. We set the standards, we own the intellectual property, we reap the rewards. But if we cede this field to China the way we ceded so much manufacturing over the past few decades, then we're right back in the same vulnerable position, dependent on a foreign adversary for critical technology, unable to compete economically, weakened strategically. So Trump's focus on robotics is really about refusing to let that pattern repeat. It's about saying, we're going to lead in the technologies that matter for the future, not just play catch-up after someone else dominates. And notice how this fits with everything else we've been talking about. Immigration reform gives us time to focus on internal challenges rather than constantly managing chaos. Agricultural security ensures we can feed ourselves. Border control protects us from external threats. And technological leadership ensures we have the economic strength to remain a global power. It's all part of the same strategy. Make America resilient, independent, and strong enough to determine its own future. Now, let's bring this home, because policies and strategies are important, but what really matters is what all of this means for you, for your family, for everyday Americans just trying to live their lives with some measure of security and dignity. If you're a senior, you've lived through a lot of changes in this country. You remember when America felt more stable, when communities were tighter knit, when you didn't worry as much about crime or chaos or whether the country would still be recognizable to your grandchildren. And over the past couple decades, you've watched things drift in directions that probably made you uneasy. You've seen borders become meaningless. You've seen manufacturing jobs disappear. You've watched grocery prices climb while your savings buy less and less. You've seen communities change rapidly, sometimes in ways that feel disorienting. You've worried about safety, about the future, about whether leaders in Washington have any idea what regular people are dealing with. So, what does Trump's announcement mean for you? Let's break it down practically. Stronger borders and controlled immigration means safer communities. When we know who's in the country, when we're actually vetting people and enforcing laws, crime goes down. Resources aren't as strained. Schools can function better. Hospitals aren't overwhelmed. Your neighborhood feels more stable. Agricultural protections and food security mean more stable prices. When American farmers aren't being driven out of business by foreign dumping, when we're producing more of our own food domestically, supply chains are shorter and more reliable. You're less vulnerable to international disruptions, and over time, as farming becomes economically viable again, rural communities start recovering. Trade enforcement and manufacturing revival mean more jobs for your children and grandchildren. When we stop letting other countries manipulate trade to destroy American industries, when we insist on fair competition, businesses can operate here profitably again. That means employment, economic opportunity, communities with a future rather than just a past. National security upgrades from military strength to technological leadership mean a safer world for future generations. When America is strong, when we're not dependent on adversaries, when we can take care of ourselves and defend our interests, your grandchildren grow up in a more stable, prosperous environment. Now, none of this happens overnight. These are long-term strategic shifts, not quick fixes. There will be bumps along the way. There will be resistance from people who benefited from the old arrangements. There will be criticism and controversy and setbacks. But the fundamental question is, do we continue down the path we were on, increasing dependency, weakening sovereignty, losing the ability to control our own destiny, or do we make the hard choices necessary to restore strength, independence, and security? Trump's announcement signals a commitment to that second path. It says, we're not going to accept decline as inevitable. We're going to fight for American interests. We're going to prioritize our own people. We're going to rebuild what's been torn down. And for seniors especially, that should resonate, because you lived through an era when American leadership actually led, when policies were designed to strengthen the country, not weaken it, when patriotism wasn't considered controversial, when America felt like it was moving forward, not backward. That's what this announcement is really about, recapturing that sense of purpose and direction. It's about looking at the challenges clearly, naming them honestly, and taking concrete action rather than just managing decline. So let's wrap this all together. We started by asking why this announcement hit with such impact, why it sent adversaries scrambling, why it matters so much right now. The answer is that Trump laid out a comprehensive strategy addressing multiple dimensions of American vulnerability all at once. Immigration reform to restore social cohesion and border security, agricultural protection to prevent economic warfare and ensure food independence, trade enforcement to stop predatory practices, technological leadership to win the future. Each of these pieces reinforces the others. Together, they represent a fundamental shift from defense to offense, from managing decline to pursuing strength, from accepting the world as it is to shaping the world as we want it to be. For Americans who have watched America's position weaken over decades, who've seen promises made and broken, who've watched leaders talk tough but act weak, this kind of comprehensive strategy feels different. It feels like someone's actually serious about changing direction. Will it work? That depends on execution, on political will, on whether the American people support it strongly enough to overcome the inevitable resistance. But at least now there's a plan, a vision, a clear statement of priorities and principles. Compare that to what we had before open borders justified by empty rhetoric about compassion, trade policies that destroyed American industries, dependence on adversaries treated as inevitable, decline accepted as the new normal. The contrast couldn't be sharper. This announcement may turn out to be one of Trump's most significant moves yet, precisely because it doesn't just address symptoms, it goes after root causes. It doesn't just respond to immediate crises, it lays groundwork for long-term strength. It doesn't just make political points, it actually tries to solve problems. Whether you agree with every detail or not, you have to respect the ambition and the seriousness of purpose. This is what leadership looks like when it's actually trying to change things rather than just manage the status quo. And if you want to stay ahead of every major update like this one, if you want the full truth behind these announcements without the noise, the spin, and the political theatrics, make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below telling me what you think about Trump's latest move. Your voice genuinely shapes what we cover next, and this community is strongest when all of us participate.